As people are coming in, I just want to welcome all of you here. I am looking at my first slide going, Counseling Children, Children 101. Actually, what I meant to write was Counseling Children and Teens, because that's what I've spent a lot of my time doing over the last number of years. So just as people are coming in and getting settled, I want you to have a look at the following image. So this is a bit of an icebreaker. And as you can see, I've got some lovely cats up here. And so the cats are numbered. And what I often do when I start off a session with kids is I'll say, how are you feeling according to cats? So I'm going to ask you folks, how are you feeling according to cats today? So maybe some of you are feeling like number 8. Maybe you didn't sleep so well last night. Maybe you're like, oh my goodness, information overload. I don't even know what to do with myself, right? Or maybe some of you are kind of feeling a little overwhelmed at this point. That's quite a possibility. I often have kids who look for the funniest cat image. So they really like number 4. That's often a very popular one. They're feeling pretty relaxed and pretty chill. And they're kind of just taking it all in, and this is just great. I find this a really, really helpful way to kind of start off the conversation with children. So this is just a chance for you to kind of do a check-in with yourself and figure out where you are and what cat number. So if I could have a show of hands, how many of you are feeling like cat number 8? Okay, so we've got a few 8s in here. All right. How many of you are feeling like cat number 5? Maybe a little scared. Maybe like, ooh, the thought of talking to a teenager or a child is terrifying. And I don't ever want to be put in that situation, right? Maybe some of you are feeling kind of like cat number 4. You're just ready to kind of chill out and relax a little bit. We got any 4s in here? Okay, wonderful. That's great to hear. That's great to hear. Maybe some of you are feeling a little curious. I kind of look at cat number 6 and I think, yeah, he looks a little bit curious. He's like, I don't know what I think about all this, but I'm interested to hear about it a little bit. So hopefully we've got some 6s in the room as well. All right. So as you get settled, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the overview. So I want you to know God is writing his story on each of our hearts, whether we're young or old. And he desires a vibrant and trusting relationship with each of us so that we can honor and glorify him with our words, our actions, and our thoughts. So as we start our time together, it's my hope that you'll be encouraged and built up in the work that you do. So just from a show of hands, how many of you do biblical counseling either formally or informally with children or teens? How many of you have some connections with children or teens? Awesome, that's super. That is fantastic. Okay, so that's what we're here to talk about today, so you're in the right spot. All right, so with the overview slides, we often think about different myths or misconceptions that people might have about talking with children. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about mindset, so looking at the developmental perspective. So what's appropriate for a 2-year-old is not necessarily appropriate for a 14-year-old. So that's going to look very different in terms of how you approach the counseling situation. A little bit about neurodivergence. That seems to be a really popular term these days, and certainly within the school that I work at, we see a lot of children who have some sort of neurodivergence going on with them. I often talk about behavior as communication. That is something that I think we often forget. And we look at behavior and we go, okay, what is that behavior telling me? What is that child trying to tell me? That maybe they don't have the words, but they are definitely behaving in a way that communicates something to me. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about identity. And one of the things I really want to emphasize is I'm trying to present this information to you in a way that I would present it to a child or in a way that I would present it to a group of children. So my passion is definitely teens and children. I've spent about 35 years working in children's mental health and child welfare, and recently God really led me and really opened some doors for me, and I'm now working as an in-school counselor at a Christian school in Strathroy, which is like just such a blessing. after coming from working particularly at CAS for the last 20 years, which was super challenging, super rewarding, but it just got to a place where I couldn't work there anymore. So this opportunity came to me, and I have been so blessed. I've been at the school now for about 3 years, and the kids call me the feelings teacher, which is super fun. And they'll be like, Mrs. Dearlove, when are you coming to do a feelings lesson in our classroom? So I do classroom sessions, and I also talk to them individually about different things. And it's really interesting that children and teens often struggle with some of the same things that we struggle with as adults. So when we think about some of the issues that we struggle with as adults, maybe depression, anxiety, friendship issues, relationship issues, figuring out how they fit in, figuring out who they are, how do we communicate with people? I have to tell you that the COVID isolation did a really bad number on recess. Right? Kids have no idea how to problem solve. Kids had no idea how to communicate with each other, how to even play games together and have fun together because of the fact that they hadn't had that opportunity for about 1.5 years. So they were having to relearn a lot of things. I had grade 6 students that were still acting like grade 3 students because that was the last time they were in school with their peers. And the only peers that they'd had in that period of isolation was their siblings or perhaps their parents. So it was very, very difficult having them come back. But one of the things that I've really learned over the years is that it is such an honor to hear kids share their stories, to hear them talk about their hopes and dreams, to talk about the things that they are learning about God, the way that they see God, the way that they understand God, and the way that God is at work in their lives and in the lives of their families. So one of the things that I have the opportunity, very much like our theme verse, is that I have the opportunity to speak the truth to them in love and helping them to grow into the mature people that God has planned and prepared for them. So this slide here is actually an image that I often will use in talking to children. We'll talk about how God made you. And we refer to Psalm 139 there. And I explain to kids that God made them with a body, a mind, a heart, and a soul. And He has a plan and a purpose for them. I will often reference Jeremiah 29, verse 11, which talks about the fact that God has good plans for you. He has plans for you for a hope and a future. Right? And I try to get them to think about, what does that look like tomorrow? What's your day going to look like tomorrow? What's your day going to look like next week? What about next year? What about in 5 years? What do you want to be when you're a grown-up? All of those things are really important conversations in order to help them understand that God is going to be with you throughout your life, not just right now. As we're having this conversation, God wants to be there, and He has plans for you going forward. So that hope and a future is so important. So this image here references how we are created. I talked to them about the fact that God created us. He knit us together in our mother's womb, and He knit us together with a spirit or a soul, right? Our mind, I think, was referenced earlier in one of the other sessions. So I talked to them about this is your spirit or your soul. Then we have our mind, which is our thoughts, right? What do we think about things? How do we see things? What's our perspective on things? What's our attitude, right? And then we talk about our hearts. That's where our emotions sit, right? We might feel sad some days. We might feel angry some days. We might feel frustrated, discouraged. I got a note this morning from one of my parents who her little girl is in grade 5, and she's been struggling with an eating disorder for the last 2 years. And so, yes, you heard it right, since grade 3, 8 years old, she was hospitalized for an eating disorder, right? Really, really struggling socially right now in school, having a really hard time figuring out how to fit in. Playtime at recess is really tough for her. Right? So those are some of the things that at a very young age, that has an impact, right? The fact that her body is not healthy, the fact that she is not eating well is impacting her ability to be appropriately social with other children because her focus is on not eating. Her focus is on limiting her calories. And so that's taking her attention away from being able to socialize with her friends on the playground, because she will go out at recess and run laps because she wants to work off those calories that she just consumed. And as she's running laps, she's sad, right? And so we obviously intervene at that point as a school and try to get her engaged with other activities. But it's really like it's an active process of preventing her from doing some of the things that are harming her body. So we can see how her body is harming her emotions, is causing some of that sadness, right? Those thoughts of I must get rid of those calories, I must get rid of that intake, I must somehow get rid of it, is affecting her body, right? Is affecting her heart, and is affecting her soul. So that's just an example. So we look at this slide here. This is called the ACEs study, so the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And we know that we as adults are affected by sin, whether that sin occurred to us, so we were sinned against, or whether we are sinning against others. Sin is very much a factor in our day-to-day lives. As believers, right, we are forgiven, but we are still impacted by sin. And that is much the same for children. So if we look at the ACEs study, those are the adverse childhood experiences, we know that 61% of us have had at least one adverse childhood experience. So 61% of us, and I'm terrible at math too. I'm kind of with Dave on the whole, I couldn't pass it if I tried, but I'm figuring 61% is about 2 in 3 people that have had at least 100 adverse childhood experiences. So I'm going to list them off. We've got parental depression, emotional neglect, divorce or loss of a parent, parental addiction, sexual abuse, a parent in prison, physical abuse, or witnessing abuse at home. So if you think about that, that means 2 out of 3 of us have had one of those experiences at some point in our childhoods. Then you look at that 17% of us, so 1 in 5 of us, have had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Those adverse childhood experiences, so the more incidents that have occurred in a child's life, the more likely there are going to be changes in brain development, there are going to be changes in decision making, changes in learning, changes in the ability to pay attention, changes in the ability or the desire to communicate and socialize. So within a school of 200 children, you imagine that 2 out of 3, so what's that? I don't even know. Anyway, a whole bunch of my kids have had some of these experiences. Even in a private Christian school, there are definitely a lot of these factors that come into play in interacting with children. So moving on to our next slide, we're talking here a little bit about the common symptoms of mental health. And I think I've got them listed in your handout as well, but certainly we can look at them otherwise. There's a whole bunch of them that perhaps you have struggled with or you have spoken to adults who have struggled with, things like worry, fear, anxiety, sadness, difficulty learning, difficulty concentrating. Imagine that if you are thinking about, is mom or dad safe at home right now? Are they going to fight tonight? You know, is there going to be food on the table tonight? Is there going to be an appropriate conversation at the dinner table, or are things going to quickly spiral out of control? All of those things impact a child's ability to think and learn. And so we think about the impact of trauma, and we think about the impact of stress, and we know that what happens when stress and trauma occurs, cortisol is released in the brain. Cortisol is the stress hormone, and what it causes is causes the flip of the amygdala. So I will often talk to kids about the amygdala hijack. So I'd like you all to raise your right hand right now. Awesome. Okay. You guys are good at this. Wow. See, I was expecting a lot of you to raise your left hand because I'm raising my right hand. All right. So I'm going to teach you a little bit about your brain. So imagine this is your brain right here. All right, I want you to take your thumb and fold it over. That is your amygdala. Your amygdala is a tiny little part of your brain, and what it does is it lets you know something's going on. There's some stress going on, right? It could be excitement, it could be fear, it could be anger, it could be sadness, but some kind of emotion is going on. I'm having a reaction to something. You know, maybe there's a bear walking in the room right now. Nobody looked. But, so we have our amygdala, and that signals us when something stressful is happening. Then we have, over top of that, we have our hippocampus, which is the limbic system, and we have our prefrontal cortex, which is right here. So you can just kind of touch your prefrontal cortex, make sure it's still here. Hopefully you brought it with you. I thought you should know too that for those of you under the age of 25, your prefrontal cortex is still under construction. It actually doesn't fully mature until around the age of 25. So that's kind of good news. There's hope yet. Anyway, so we have our prefrontal cortex sitting over here. Now imagine that all of a sudden our amygdala senses stress, senses fear, senses something isn't quite right. What happens is it flips off our prefrontal cortex. Now I forgot to tell you, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision making, for making good choices, for thinking, for learning new information, for remembering things. That's all the job of our prefrontal cortex. Guess what? It's offline. We got problems, right? So when we come into a classroom or when we come into a counseling session and we have a child who's under stress, they're not going to take in that new information. They're really, really going to struggle to remember what you've told them. They're really going to struggle to use some of those skills that you may have been working with them on. So your first job is to regulate. And we're going to talk a little bit more about regulation later on. But just suffice it to say that we need to regulate that amygdala before we can actually do any good work with the brain, right? So again, that's where God has put us together so amazingly, because He allows our bodies and our minds and our hearts to work together so that we can actually take in what's going on around us. And that's something that I often will remind kids about when we're meeting together. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about misconceptions. So some misconceptions that people have about children are that they're miniature adults. They're really not. They're really not. Like I said, their brains are still under construction. Children don't see the world the same way as we do. They're much smaller than us, so physically they don't see the world the same way as we do, but also emotionally. They're much younger emotionally, so they don't see the world the way we do. The other misconception that we often have is that children struggle because of parenting errors. Although that is true in some cases, in many cases, children struggle in spite of their parents, right? That in spite of their parents' best efforts, children are going to struggle from time to time. We can't be there all day at school when they're being bullied. We can't be there all, on their monitoring their online use and recognizing that something negative is happening for them there, right? We can't be there on their sports team and make sure that they always win. So in many different ways, that idea of protecting our children from anything that could harm them is not necessarily possible. The other thing is that if you can sort out the behavior by rewarding, so the whole reward and punishment, the stick and carrot method, doesn't work. You're wasting your time, right? Because that's all about the external. That doesn't address the issues of the heart, right? And we need to get to the heart of the behavior rather than just paying them off with a carrot or whacking them over the head with a stick. And having worked at CAS, I can tell you that that's probably not a good idea anyway. All right, so our next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about mindset. So I'm going to tell you a little story. So I had a young person come to my office, and he came into my office and curled up on his mom's lap, was using a very young voice, almost whispering. His pronunciation was not great. He had a really, really hard time making eye contact with me. Very, very intelligent. And lots of, I would say, connection seeking with Mom in terms of, you know, I would ask him a question and he would kind of look to Mom before he answered, and often wouldn't answer. So I'd say, you know, how you doing today? Good. And he'd check with Mom. How old do you think he was? Anybody got a guess how old he might have been? 5? 10. Yep, 10 years old. Right? So from a developmental perspective, is that expected? Right? That's not so typical. Right? If I had told you he was 5 or 3, you probably would have been like, oh yeah, I could see that, you know, toddler, preschooler, you know, wanting to be close to Mommy and everything like that. So going on, learning more about him, a little boy with very high IQ, lots and lots of fears about things like germs, hand washing, being around other people, touching surfaces, touching other people, like was just very, very fearful. So as I got to know him, I learned that he'd had some very serious illnesses as a younger child. I think between the ages of 5 and 7. He'd been hospitalized several times. Then COVID came. So that affected a lot for him. And so we had this little guy who was really, really struggling with lots of different fears, right? And as we got talking, I said to him, I said, tell me a little bit about what you think about God. He says, well, I don't think he's real. I think he's just a story. I said, oh, why do you think he's just a story? Because I prayed when I was in the hospital and it took a long time to get better. Right? So he had lots of fears that we had to work through, and really at the heart issue wasn't the fear. The heart issue was really about he didn't trust God, right? So for him to learn that God is trustworthy, that God is faithful, that God is there for him, and that God desires to walk with him through his struggles was so important. And it was amazing that as we got going and we started talking together and we started meeting together, that slowly, slowly he was able to, as a result of talking about who God was, who God wanted him to be, right? And who he was in God's eyes, that really, really helped him to let go of some of his fears. And he went from, like, he would leave the session, my bathroom is right across the hall from my office. He would leave the session probably 3 or 4 times in an hour to go wash his hands. By the end of it, he never washed his hands, and there was a really big significant decrease in the number of times that he would wash his hands. He started coming in without a mask on. He started sitting next to Mom, and there was like eventually space on the couch. So there were lots of things that demonstrated that he was able to trust God with his body, right? With his well-being, with his health, and with his identity, really. So that would be an example of mindset. I want to move on to this slide here. So the other piece around mindset that I want you to be aware of is that developmental perspective, and then the idea too that we have lots of different people whose brains work differently. So the impact of neurodiversity, so for example, giftedness, autism, ADHD, as well as brain injuries, fetal alcohol. So lots of children that I meet with, particularly when I was working at CAS, a lot of children I met with were prenatally exposed to drugs or alcohol. That is a birth injury. That is absolutely a birth injury, right? and a very permanent birth injury. And so for children who are impacted by prenatal exposure to alcohol in particular, there are really big struggles physically and in terms of their capacity to learn, in terms of their capacity to learn from cause and effect, that really affect your ability to counsel effectively with them. So it's important to be aware of that and get lots of good background information before you start to develop a plan and start to develop a plan with that child as to where to go from here once you start meeting with them. So behavior is communication. I think I've talked about that a little bit, but have you ever heard the term attention-seeking behavior? Everybody heard that term? Anybody think it's accurate? That's a trick question. It's actually connection-seeking, right? Often what happens is children are seeking connection. They are seeking to be seen, they are seeking to be heard, and they're seeking to be valued or validated for who they are. So what we sometimes may mislabel as attention-seeking behavior is truly just an attempt to seek a connection, either with their peers or with adults or with their parents or with their caregivers, right? They are seeking to connect with that individual. And some of those behaviors can be pretty annoying sometimes. So it's really important that one of the things we want to do is be able to have them seek attention appropriately and seek attention in ways that we are going to want to respond to. And then identity. This really comes into play in grade 8. So we've had a lot of conversations with our grade 8 students over the past year. We've had a couple of students in there who have really questioned their sexual orientation. That started in grade 6 for a couple of them, and hugely influenced by social media. Don't even get me started on that. But we've been able to have some really direct conversation with them about who did God make you to be, right? What is God's plan for your life? What is God's purpose for your life? Who do you want to be? How can you honor God with your body, with your mind, with your thoughts, with your emotions, right? That is the ultimate goal. We talk a lot about the kids actually are learning parts of the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Catechism, throughout their grade 8 year. And so they're actually learning about what does God say? What is your purpose in life? And so for them to kind of hear that and then apply that to their lives is super important. So we talk about identity and we say, who are your 3 closest friends? Who are the 3 people that you admire the most, that you look up to, that you want to be like? Because those are the people that you're going to try and emulate as you leave this school and as you move on into high school. Why do you want to be like them? How can you honor God with your life, with your friendships, with your efforts? Who does God say you are? Right? Because that's so important that they understand that. So we'll talk a little bit about identity. I want to go back to neurodiversity a little bit because I think this is a really up and coming term, but it's a term that has so much relevance both in the classroom and in the counseling situation. So there's a lot of different neurodivergent brains. So we have things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, perhaps someone that has a bipolar diagnosis, perhaps Tourette's syndrome. One that I've heard recently very often is a highly sensitive person, so HSP. And I'm not quite sure what I think of it because these are all, again, labels that I often read in psychoeducational reports when kids are coming into school and we get a psycho-ed eval on them and we hear that. And I think, well, what does that exactly mean? But the one little girl that in particular that I can think of, she is just so aware and fearful of basically everything and everybody and whatever anybody thinks of her. And she's in grade 2. Right? And she constantly walks around the school looking terrified. And so we have to really work hard with her. Things like noise canceling headphones, things like muted lighting in the classroom, giving her a quiet space to transition into the classroom, just to help her feel confident that she can come in and do her best learning there. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, only to help you understand or hear that when you hear this terminology, it actually is pretty relevant. I look at it and go, like, one of my teachers, her son is autistic, and so she has shared with me a lot of information about that. And one of the things that her son is so confident of, and he always says, I am made in God's image. Like, it's one of his lines that he says to himself. He repeats a lot of different phrases, but that's one of them. He's like, my brain is special. It works special. It works different than your brain. Did you know that, Mrs. Dearlove? Did you know? And he'll try to get me to look in his eyes to see how his brain is working. I can't really see through your eyes, but I'll take your word for it, buddy. Right? And so it is really, really amazing to meet people who are neurodivergent and who are still so confident and aware of who they are, and that God made them special, and that He has special gifts and abilities that nobody else has. And he will tell me, he says, I think in pictures. Did you know that? I think about pictures all the time. And he has a picture of me in his head of wearing a certain shirt that he really loves. And so that's his picture of me, is me wearing that shirt. I don't know why, because, yeah. Anyway, ADHD is another one that there's a lot of overlap between, all I want to say about this image is that there's a lot of overlap between ADHD and autism. So some of the things that you will see that are similar are special interests and passions. Executive functioning difficulties. So probably within your practice, and this is something that's also very similar for people with who have been prenatally exposed to drugs and alcohol, is executive functioning is often an area that they really, really struggle. So for example, they will really struggle with time management, with organizing, understanding that this is going to take me 20 minutes to do, or this is going to take me 30 minutes to do. They have a really hard time with time management. They have a really hard time with self-regulation, with even regulating their bodies and being able to be aware that, hey, I shouldn't have done that. They have no idea of cause and effect often, which means that they make really poor decisions. I had a young lady at my school last week who decided that she felt like bringing a lighter to school. Grade 5. She brought a lighter to school. And I didn't ask her why, because she doesn't know. I said, so what were you going to use the lighter for? I thought maybe we would have a campfire at recess. I'm like, well, that seems like, that's interesting. But what do you think about having a campfire at recess? Do you think that would be a good idea? Well, no, there's not enough wood out on the playground. So it's unsafe, but no, there's not enough wood out on the playground. So that would have been a terrible idea in her mind. So that's why she brought me the lighter. Okay. So thinking about mindset a little bit, going back to mindset, because I do want to look at that just for a minute. There's something I missed here. Yes. So going back to, nope. There we are. Mindset. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about, which it's going to sound like we have lots of different kids in our school, and we do. We had one little girl, she's in grade 4, and she was completely unable to cope with school. So could not get out of bed, would come to school and be like basically like a floppy doll. Very pale, couldn't necessarily figure out even how to get her stuff off to get down to her classroom, right? Would just kind of plop down on the floor in the front hallway, and that was it. That's as far as she got. So, and this was a kid who previously loved school and was so excited to be there and was so proud to be in grade 4. Parents eventually ended up taking her for some testing and trying to figure out what was wrong, because there were also like extreme outbursts at home. There was this inability to think clearly. She really wasn't working well at all. It turned out her iron level was in the single digits, right? So what I want to encourage you with is if you are seeing a child and you are seeing things that just don't make sense, make sure we are physically embodied beings. God created us with bodies. We need to make sure that that body is functioning well and that all parts of that body are functioning well. So she has now been on iron supplements for about since November, early November, and we're now seeing that she has more capacity to be in her classroom. She has more capacity to actually play at recess time. She has more capacity to be engaged in her learning, much like she was in grade 3. So there's now, a bunch of tests being done to try and figure out as well why her iron is so low and why it is that her body is so depleted of iron. But all that to say, and I'll get back into that a little bit more with method, all that to say is that you need to do a really, really good assessment up front when you are meeting with kids to have a really good understanding. How is their body working? How is their mind working? So for some children, a developmental delay can really impact their ability to engage in counseling, can really impact their ability to engage in learning because they are taking in information much slower than someone else. Literacy is another piece. So if you're giving homework, for example, to a counselee, making sure they can read it. I had a young man that I saw for addictions, and he couldn't read. So I know Deepak talked about that a little bit, about reading with the gentleman who was an alcoholic that he was counseling, reading with him during sessions. And that's what I ended up doing with my counselee as well, is we would read a lot of the stuff. I would read to him, and then I pre-recorded some stuff to read to him so that he could listen to it rather than having him try and read it on his own, because he was just shutting down and like, I can't read. And he would get so distressed because he couldn't read. 25-year-old guy. So yeah, I think you have to sort of be aware of the body's capacity, but also the mind's capacity, because it's really important to tailor your counseling or to tailor your conversations to suit where that child or where that young person is at. I think that, trauma, yes. First of all, highly recommend the Christian Trauma Healing Network. It is available online. There's a ton of great information on there. Beth Broom is a wonderful, wonderful presenter. She has a number of different, she'll do webinars, she'll do all kinds of great stuff that really helps in terms of providing a Christian perspective to people who have experienced trauma and children who've experienced trauma. So another example of how our body, our mind, and our heart work together with our soul is through a young lady that I met. She was 14 years old when she came to me. She was just finishing grade 8, super anxious about high school, and had begun having serious stomach pain, vomiting, nausea, headaches, just really, really feeling unwell, lots of heartburn, all kinds of stuff. And so this kept happening, and she couldn't really figure out what was going on with her, because she was typically quite a healthy young lady. And then as we started talking together, I learned that she had experienced sexual abuse at a very young age, at a actually pre-verbal age. So under the age of 2, typically children develop language around 2 years old. She had experienced sexual abuse prior to that. And so there were some triggers happening in her life that caused her to not necessarily recall what was happening, but have physical symptoms that she really couldn't understand or explain, and was eventually able to talk about what had happened, and eventually able to talk about the experiences. And her family had kind of, at the time, in their best ability, had decided the perpetrators didn't live in this country. They had moved to a different country. And so they couldn't pursue charges because she was pre-verbal, and they were never able to prosecute them. And so they decided, okay, well, you know, she was so young, hopefully she'll forget about it, and hopefully it won't ever, you know, happen again, because the people that did it were gone. But eventually that's where it was connected to. And so we were able to have some conversations, and there were actually things that she remembered, like pictures that she remembered seeing, images that she remembered seeing of the abuse, and that was what was affecting her stomach and everything like that. So we were able to talk through that, and again, helping her to understand, first of all, because she had a lot of questions about why would God allow that to happen? Where was God in all that? You told me that God has a plan and a purpose for my life. Really? Was that his plan and purpose? Right? And being able to mourn and lament with her about how, no, God does not desire for any of us to be harmed, and especially for little ones to be harmed, right? And being able to slowly redeem that story and understand that God can use her pain and suffering, and God does gather her tears in a bottle. That was such a meaningful verse to her, was to talk about how God knows your pain. He feels your pain, and it hurts his heart just as much as it hurt your heart at the time. And to be able to provide comfort and to be able to point her to God's word and how he loves her and he cares for her, and he has an amazing purpose and plan for her. She is now a young lady that she's grown up. I think she would be 19 now, and is actually really having a positive impact within her youth group and within her circle of friends. And she has really come forward a long way in terms of being able to use that pain and suffering for good in other people's lives. So. All right. Autistic love languages. This is just a fun one I put in here because I thought it's kind of a cool one when you think about what you might see either in your home or in your counseling office. So I have I have 3 kids, sorry. 2 of them had friends who were on the autism spectrum growing up. So I had one young guy, and he loved my daughter, absolutely loved her. Lived across the street, and he would come over to our house every single day, and he would come into my living room, and he would look at my kids' pictures on the walls and remind me of their names in case I had forgotten. And he would remind me what grade they were in, and he would remind me what their favorite subject was in school or what show they liked to watch. And then he would head off downstairs and go play with them. So that was the info dump, sharing his special interests. He always had to tell me all of these things. Another one that I really noticed a lot was helping without words. So another young guy that was friends with my son, he would come over and he would help Jacob beat games, like computer games. He would come over and he would just grab the controller from him and start beating whatever game they were playing on, Super Mario something or other, and he would help him with it. And then Jacob would say, well, tell me what you did. Like, how did you do that? And he'd be like, he'd take the controller and he'd do it all over again, but he would never explain what he was doing. So that's just an example of some things you might see from someone on the autism spectrum. All right, moving on. Kind inference. This one here is super, super important, and this is super important not only for ourselves, but it's also really, really important for our children that we come into contact with. When we think about kind inference, what we want to think about here is that everyone is doing the very best they can with the information or skills that they have, right? So having respect for that. So that goes along with things like obtaining consent. So getting a child's consent to meet with you. I never meet with children alone. I typically will have a parent stay with me, either for part of the beginning part of the session, the ending part of the session, or kind of a sandwich. And then if a child does want to meet with me alone, I always, get their consent for that first. Now in the school, it's a little bit different. Kids will come down and come and talk to me, and then we get consent from parents for them to come and talk to me. Typically for kids under the age of 12, I get written consent from both the parent and the child before I meet with them individually, but that's something that's really important to remember. So when we look at kind inference, we really want to look at the fact that parents are doing the best they can, children are doing the best they can, and it's our job as a biblical counselor to just kind of help walk the path and point them always, always, always back to Scripture, right? This is their child, right? Children are a gift from the Lord, not to you as their counselor, right? Children are a gift to the Lord to their parents, whether that's an adoptive parent or whether that is a foster parent or whether that is an original parent, as I call it. Either way, that is their child, right? And it's your job to come alongside and to be a signpost and to point them in the right direction, right? As I really liked Deepak's term too about being a mini Messiah. You are not there to save the family. You are there to help the family function. You are there to point them to the path of optimal functioning, whether that's in a school setting, whether that's at home, whether that's with extended family, that you are there to really point them in the right direction. And that needs to be done with two guardrails. If you picture two guardrails on either side, and this is something I often will talk to parents about, imagine yourself driving down a mountain road, right? And you're going downhill and there's going to be a hairpin turn coming up. What do you want on the outside of that turn? Anybody want a guardrail? Because I do. You haven't seen me drive. I'd want like an 8-foot guardrail, right? Because I'm not going down the mountain. So we want that guardrail. That is structure, right? That every home, whether it is, a home with teenagers, whether it is a home with little ones, we need structure, right? And the Bible teaches us that. God teaches us throughout His Word about structure, that there are rules, there are expectations, there are ways that we need to do things that provide for best functioning. If we look at the 10 Commandments, and I will often talk to kids about the 10 Commandments and say, what is the big picture about the 10 Commandments? It's how to love God, how to love others, how to get along with other people, and how to keep you safe, right? So if we think about that from a child's perspective and we say, yeah, and that's the same way with mom and dad. Mom and dad have a job to keep you safe, to teach you how to love God, to teach you how to love others, and to teach you how to get along, right? To teach you how to get along in the world. That's why that's a really, really important job that mom and dad have. And it's a really, really important job that you have. That's why we have structure in our lives. The other side of that coin, or the other guardrail, is nurture, right? Making sure that kids feel seen, feel heard, feel validated, and feel loved, right? That is the most important gift that you can give a child. And that doesn't mean you let them get away with whatever, but it means that they are really, truly seen. I see that you are hurting. Often, especially my grade 8 boys, they're all tough and everything. They'll come into my office. Give me a little bit of attitude, right? And I'll say, oh, what are you here for today? I don't know. You want to talk about it? No. Well, what's the problem? I don't know. Right? And so I had a young guy in grade 8 who was experimenting with self-harm. So he was cutting himself. And it had been observed at school, it had been observed at home, and he just basically told his teacher and told his parents, I'm not talking to you about it. Okay, go talk to Mrs. Dearlove. He was not talking to me about it either. But I just said to him, I said, I'm not going to ask you why or anything like that, but I do need to know, like, basically what is going on? Like, what are you doing? And he said, well, I don't want to talk to you. Well, initially, he just kind of kept his head down. He's like, I don't know. And I said, okay. You know what's super, super important? When we have a conversation, we tell each other the truth, right? You may tell me the truth. And if the truth is you don't want to talk to me about it, then you need to tell me that. But if the truth is you don't want to talk to me about it yet, that's okay too. You can tell me that truth. Or if the truth is that you know why and you'd like to share it with me, you're welcome to do that, right? But in here, we always speak the truth. I know you know, so I don't know is a lie. And I don't accept lies in my office. I only accept the truth, right? And it was like a dam burst. And I got all kinds of stuff of what was going on. He was having some really significant conflict with an older brother who was basically beating on him at home. And he didn't want to tell mom and dad because he was scared that the older brother was going to make it worse for him. And so over a series of weeks, we were able to talk about, like, what is going on for you, and he was able to talk to me a little bit about the self-harm and come up with some other ways of letting people know he was hurting and in trouble and needed help with something. Because that's essentially what it was. He needed help to deal with his older brother. And eventually the older brother was removed from the home, so that was a good thing. Okay, so kind inference. We're going to get into methods a little bit because I know we're kind of rushing through here. These are some of the things that I use in terms of assessment for kids to try and help me understand what is going on for them. So obviously, first and foremost, we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of how their body works, right? Are they having trouble seeing, for example? We had a little guy that started junior kindergarten and was constantly tripping over everything, was constantly falling over everything, was literally walking into walls, literally walking into tables and chairs, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. And he was constantly covered in bruises. He was just a hot mess. Well, it turned out he needed glasses. Like, he literally could not hardly see more than 2 feet in front of his face. So of course he was tripping over everything. He's doing great now, hasn't fallen in probably about a month. So again, making sure that you have a good understanding of how their physical body is working. That's important. The SCARED questionnaire is one that I often use. You can download it online. It is a child assessment for anxiety. It is fantastic. You just print it off. You have the child fill out one copy. You have the parents fill out the parent version. And then you can score it. And it gives you an idea of what are some of the fears or anxieties that are going on for that child. Because if you don't know what's wrong, then it's really hard to try and determine how to point them in the right direction, right? The SNAP is another one, the SNAP 4. That is, I think there's 26 questions on one of them, and then there's like 88 on another one. That is for ADHD, so for kids who are struggling with ADHD. You can use that one. The the child depression inventory is a really helpful tool as well, just to have an understanding of what is making you sad, how long have you been feeling sad, what are some of the things that help you feel happier, what are some of the things that make you feel sad. The brief is an inventory for executive functioning. The autism questionnaire, I don't love the DSM-5. It's a really, really It's changed the identification of autism. So I prefer the 4, and there's a checklist in there actually that you can go through and actually see whether you're seeing some of the same things. So we had a student that joined us in JK a couple of years ago, nonverbal, not toilet trained, unable to make eye contact, would roll on the floor and like just really interesting, would line up all the cars on the lines on the floor tiles. All kinds of really interesting things. And the family doctor said, no, he's not autistic. He actually just has a communication disorder. He has a speech delay. He has dyspraxia. And we're like, okay, that looks very different from a speech delay. And eventually the parents were able to go and see a developmental pediatrician and learn that he was indeed on the autism spectrum. And so we were able to provide appropriate supports for him in school because of the fact that we had a correct diagnosis. All the speech therapy in the world wasn't going to change how he interacted with his environment. So that needed to be figured out first. So for scaling questions, this is something that I often will do with kids. I'll have them draw a timeline of their day or a timeline of their week or even a timeline of their life. I find this really helpful with teens. So one of the things in my 14-year-old young lady that I met with was we started a timeline and we talked about, you know, where does God show up in your story, right? When did you first hear about God? When did you first hear who he was? When did you first start to kind of take on faith for yourself and understand that you can have a personal relationship with the Lord, right? And as we were kind of going through that and drawing that timeline, she had no memories prior to the age of 6. She couldn't remember anything. And the family had moved when she turned 6. The family had moved to a different house. She couldn't even tell me if she shared a room with anybody in her old house. She couldn't tell me anything. So that was a cue to me of like literally no memories. And her mom was shocked to find out she had no memories prior to the age of 6. And then as we started exploring that, that's when we learned that that's when the abuse had occurred. So. Yeah. So timelines are super helpful. Also, asking kids, like, what are you good at? What are your strengths? What do you enjoy? What do you look forward to in your day? What is fun for you? How much time do you spend on social media? Because if you're 13 or 14, it's probably about 5 hours a day. They spend 6 hours a day in school. Is that sad or what? That means 11 hours of their day is already tied up between social media and school. Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. But talk about scaling questions. So things like giving them a scale of 1 to 10. I had a little girl that came to me, her mom actually came to me the first day back after March break. She's 7. And she has been scratching herself. So I'm like, what does that mean? And so what she's been scratching her, like the inside of her arms, more so on the one side than the other. She's right-handed, so she's scratching the inside of her left arm. And she's scratching the insides of her legs. And so we talked about scaling with her. I kind of asked her, I'm usually pretty direct. I'm like, so, Mom tells me you have some scratches. She's like, yep. So who made those scratches? The cat. I'm like, you don't have a cat. The dog? You don't have a dog. Anyway, then she said it was her. And I said, well, what was happening? I was in my room. Okay. How come you were in your room? And she didn't want to tell me. So then we moved on here. And I said, how were you feeling when you were in your room? What color were you feeling? And she said she was feeling red. I said, oh, wow, you were feeling red? Huh. That says angry. And it says mad and furious and yelling and aggressive. She's like, yeah, I was fighting with my mom. I said, oh, wow. Yeah, and I'm not allowed to fight with mom, so she sent me to my room. Oh, boy, right? So then we got talking, and I said, you know, what number of red were you feeling? Were you feeling like a 10 red, or were you feeling like a 1 red? She was feeling a 12 red. So then we were able to talk about, she was really mad at herself for fighting with mom. And so she was scratching herself in frustration, right? And had opened up the skin and then was picking at it. So, yeah. Anyway, and then we just talk a little bit about, and I often will use this chart. It's super helpful because then I can ask, like, what color were you feeling and how big was that feeling? Was it a 10? Was it really, really big? Or was it just a little bit? And that really, really helps in terms of helping kids to identify their emotions, to understand what's going on. Especially for children with fetal alcohol, often they don't really connect what's going on in their bodies or in their hearts with what their actions are exhibiting. So they may be crying, and I had one little girl actually, I said, oh, like, you look so sad, you're crying. What are you crying about? She's like, no, I'm not. My eyes are wet. Yeah, they're wet because you're crying, honey. No. And she's still like sobbing in my office. It's just because my eyes are wet and they're leaking. She's 11, right? And so helping her to connect that, yeah, you know what, sometimes when we're feeling really low, we're really tearful, that is actually naturally a thing that happens is we cry. And so being able to talk about that and being able to scale those feelings. Another really, really helpful tool that I use is how big is my problem? If it's a tiny problem, we don't need a grown-up to help us with it. But if it gets to be a medium problem or a big problem, we probably need to ask for some help, right? And often teens will laugh at me because I get some older teens too. I'll say to them, okay, how big is your problem? And I have them show me on this. They're like, seriously? I'm like, okay, well, then tell me, right? Because did your reaction match the size of the problem, right? So your buddy just threw a pencil at you in grade 8 and you freaked out and screamed at him. Okay, what was the size of the pencil throwing? Oh, it was a small problem. What was the size of your reaction? Well, you tipped your desk and screamed your head off. That was kind of more of a emergency reaction, right? So teaching kids about matching. What is your reaction compared to the size of the problem? Making sure that it matches. All right. I'm going to fly through some of this stuff because it's super important, but it's stuff that you can find online. So circle of security, this is really about attachment. So a lot of times what I do too in my work, I've done lots of attachment, parenting assessment attachments in my work at CAS, and so a lot of the things that I share from here is related to attachment material. But our job is really to be that secure base and safe haven for children, right? That's a parent's job, that's our job as counselors. Guess who else does that? God does that for us. He is our secure base and safe haven. We can come to him with anything, right? Nothing is too big for him. His hands are exactly the right size for whatever we bring to him, right? And he always welcomes us in, no matter what's going on. He welcomes us in and he says, come here, talk to me, tell me what's going on. Let me help you with this, right? And that's our job too. When we think about circle of security, we want our kids to go out, experience the world, do things, learn new things, be excited about their learning, eventually grow up to be, amazing adults that have grandchildren and hopefully live close enough to you that you can visit them every day. That didn't happen with mine, but okay. Anyway, and then as they go out, we watch over them, we delight in them, we help them, and we enjoy with them. Does that sound familiar? Right? Because in so many ways we look at God the Father and we think, yeah, you know what? He is watching over me. He does delight in his children, right? He does help us. And he enjoys with us. And he welcomes us back when we're struggling. When we're having a hard time, he protects us, he comforts us, he delights in us, and he organizes our feelings. And he sits with us in those hard feelings. Like we learned yesterday in the book of Lamentations, right? He doesn't say, you know, take that negativity elsewhere. I can't deal with that, right? He says, bring it all to me, right? And I will sit with you, I will be with you in those hard moments. I'm not going anywhere. I'm never going to leave you or forsake you, right? And that's exactly what our children need. That's exactly what our youth need when they come to us. That we're not leaving this room. We're going to tell the truth to each other, right? We're going to talk about hard things. Even if they're hard, we're still going to tell the truth to each other, right? And I'm going to ask you to do some hard things when you go home. And I'm going to ask you to do some hard things when you go to school. But guess what? We're going to do it together, right? Knowing that you don't have to do it alone. All right, these are just a couple of other, and I will happily share my email address if you want to have some of these slides. You're welcome to have them. I can email them to you. These are just some other ways that I kind of help kids with regulation. This is a really fun activity. It's the blob tree. And we look at the blob tree and we go, who are you most like? And I don't know if you can see the numbers here, but all of these blobs, some of them have smiles on their faces, some of them look kind of sad, some of them look kind of scared, whatever. So I'll ask kids, who are you most like currently? And then who do you want to be like? And so giving them an opportunity to think about that really gets into some great conversations around identity, right? Tell me a little bit about you. How do your parents see you? How does Jesus see you? How do your friends see you? How do you want to be seen, right? What are you trying to portray? And how can you do that? How can you honor God with who you are? All right, musts, really quickly. I have 5 minutes. All right, this is my favorite part of all. Duty to report, confidentiality. Really fun. You don't get away from CAS for 20 years without having to remember that you have to say that stuff. Anyway, duty to report. Basically what that means is anything that you tell me here that puts you at risk or that puts someone else at risk that we can't find a solution for, a safe solution for, I then need to report that. So for example, if Johnny comes into my office and says, every day at 4:30 when I get home from school, my dad whacks me over the head with a frying pan, right? And mom doesn't know about it. And I have to go home after school because that's when the bus drops me off at home. I got to do something about that, right? He's at imminent risk of being harmed again at 4:30 because that's what happens every day at 4:30, right? So that is my duty to report. But other things too. So for example, we have some situations where parents are divorced and getting involved in new relationships, and that new partner is less than ideal and treating the children in a less than ideal way. And so recently I did have to make a report. So don't be afraid of that, but yeah, that absolutely needs to happen. Confidentiality is really important. So sometimes kids will tell you stuff and they'll say, please don't tell my mom or dad. Depending on what it is, I will right up front tell them, yes, we don't have to talk to mom and dad about that. You know, that's okay. But there are things that we absolutely must tell mom and dad about. Building trust and respect by showing trust and respect. I always begin and end my sessions in prayer. I will often ask kids if they would like to pray or if they would like to join me in praying. And it is amazing what kids pray for. I had a little 5-year-old who prayed that she would have a nice husband someday. I'm like, well, we're probably not going to have to worry about that for a few years yet. But, you know, I just thought it was great that she could bring that up. Give time to process. So for children, it takes up to 15 repetitions to learn a new skill when they are in a good headspace, when their prefrontal cortex isn't flipped off, right? When they're in a hard space, it can take up to 300 times. So remember that. The other thing with processing is typically for most kids, it's about 20 to 30 seconds. That was 20 to 30 seconds, what I just did there. Actually, I think it was only 20, right? So if you say, you need to go tidy up your room, you need to give them time to process that request and go tidy up their room, right? Because it takes about 20 seconds for kids to actually process. Attention span, that's always a huge one, so be aware of that. All right, my very last list here, and I think I've put it on the handout as well. There are some amazing resources here. Some of them are, so the zones of regulation is the little colored boxes. There's also a book that relates to that. It's called Signals by Sherilyn Orr, and it's basically zones of regulation from a Christian perspective. I love it. It's fantastic. So there's a lot of different good resources here. Have a look at those. And then just finally, I would really like to share this prayer with you. It's something that I think is so important because I think sometimes we don't see the results until years later, and sometimes we never see the results, right? We don't necessarily see the results. And so I think it's really important to be aware of that, but recognize that it is super important that what you say and your words have weight. With parents, your words have weight with children. And so you may not necessarily in the counseling room ever see the results of what's going on for someone, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. We have to trust God that He is in the work. It's not about us. It's not about what we're doing. And we may never see the result, but for sure, for sure He does. So it says here, excuse me, it helps now and then to step back and take the long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is beyond our vision. This is what we are about. We plant seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects beyond our capability. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something and do it well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for God's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end result, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders. We are ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future not our own. So thank you very much. I'll stick around for a couple minutes if there's any questions or any commentary. Thank you.